think we should really talk about Greenland specifically, because Greenland is, again, another one of these aspects of a multidimensional campaign that's being waged for control of key areas of not only security to individual nation states, but security of the planet itself. The Danish intelligence service and the Danish military has known for a long time that Greenland hosts a lot of evidence of extraterrestrial life that has been concentrated in the Arctic regions and that came down at different points along the way throughout our last several thousand-year period of time, and sort of set up shop in an area that they knew was going to be very hostile to typical humanity and was going to not be highly explored and highly foot trafficked in the sense of awareness and exposure. And so when we look at what is actually in Greenland, one of the things that's underneath the Greenland ice and the Greenland shelf, and it's underneath Iceland as well, there's a massive tunnel that goes, it's a submarine tunnel beneath the North Atlantic Ocean between Iceland and Greenland. But one of the things beneath Greenland specifically is an enormous military research installation that has been reverse engineering not only extraterrestrial technology, but studying extraterrestrial style microbes and attempting to weaponize them in a fashion that they can survive in the highly ultraviolet photonic environment of this planet, right? The sunlight itself really is the best disinfectant for us as humanity, and it's one of the primary defense mechanisms against pathogens that are not of earthly origin.
You are warmly welcome to MBNK News, a platform designed to contrast the worldly fact with the kingdom through the original. We have a heavy-hitting show today. If you have been following the news the last week or even this week, you know the surface level story. As the fallout from the Epstein-Saga continue and aliens and UFOs files to be released and now iron on the news. But to understand the mechanics under the hood, you need a specialist. SG Anon of QNews Patriot is back to help us peel the layers of this smoke screen and look past the media noise. Since the last time we had SG on the show, the world has changed quite a bit, from the little drops to a big explosion. I couldn't think of a better person to break all this down than with him as a rhetoric expert on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome SG Anon, the legend behind the QNews Patriot, on the stage. Welcome back, SG. How have you been?
I've been well, Veronique. Thank you for having me back. There's a lot going on in the world.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Please tell our audience again a little bit more of yourself and also your work, if you may, please, before we dive into the current update. Thank you.
I'd be happy to. So the work that I put out is primarily found on a Rumble channel called the QNews Patriot. It's found on Rumble under the name QNews Patriot, not under the name SG Anon. And my own personal history sort of plays into the story that became that particular podcast, which really just started as a commentary exercise after a gentleman that I deeply respected for a lot of my formative adult life, my 20s and into my very early 30s, after he and I had a discussion about the irregular war that's happening in the world right now. And when I say irregular war, I think a lot of people are going to be initially confused at what that means. They obviously see that there is conflict playing out. They see that there's tension between Ukraine and Russia that continues to cause bloodshed. They can see that there's factions all around the planet that are very interested in maintaining what I would characterize as the old world status quo. And of course, we have to factor into that there are interested parties across the entirety of the Western world who do not want to see a transformation of the Western world's financial and monetary system, which has been concentrated in the hands of what amounts to a few billionaire oligarchs for over the last 400 to 500 years in time, depending on how you want to trace that lineage. My own story plays a little bit into this. I was 19 years old when I realized that the world was in control of 13 separate bloodline families that traced their lineage back to the ancient Phoenicians of old. And when we talk about that, we're literally talking about the Canaanites of old, referenced in the Old Testament of the Bible a number of times. And those particular families had maintained control of government structures and superpowers. They had maintained control of the large intelligence communities and military activities of the entirety of the planet for at least the last 500 to 1,000 years in their present form. You can trace them actually back to the Knights Templar and the Vatican, as well as the City of London and the military forces of Washington, D.C., post-U.S. Civil War in the 19th century. But bottom line is, it was all part of the same largesse control structure. It was all part of the same mass. And so when I realized that, as a relatively young man, and I made some discoveries about the things that were in people's food and the regulations that permitted such. I made some discoveries about the individuals who had been mysteriously suicided, such as Mr. Gary Webb, a phenomenal hero for humanity that people should really pay attention to, or Vince Foster, who was slated to testify against the Wicked Witch of Washington, Hillary Clinton. And so as I realized that, again, at that 19-year-old age, I sought to understand more about the world and to get involved and to do what I could, being sort of feeling like I wasn't very helpful being behind a screen. At the time, we had the early versions of YouTube coming out and maintaining in the world. We had the early versions of some of the social media. I think at the time that I made some of these discoveries, Apple was on the iPhone 3, and now we're sort of on the iPhone. I think it's like 19 or 20 or something like that. So with respect to all of that, I attempted to go and understand the world in a greater depth. I had an unsuccessful attempt at joining the armed forces of the United States military, was not able to do so, but that put me on a journey, on a pathway for me to have a deep study of a very sort of like daily, day job during the day and nighttime study and education by night about things like espionage and irregular warfare and sleight of hand, and how these institutions were able to hide in the shadows for so long, and how intelligence operations and counterintelligence operations are waged against perfectly conscious human beings against their knowledge or will or even awareness. And so that led me up to the year 2022. I went through the entirety of the 2010s decade, sort of having this approach to life. I worked by day, I studied at night, I tried the good old-fashioned American family approach. I was lucky enough to have a young child along in that journey, but it led me all of the way up to 2022 after the first Trump administration had publicly left office. And when I say publicly left office, the reason that is so important is because there was a veritable wellspring, a treasure trove of information that you could find online. And if you were willing to look at it with a skeptical lens, or a lens that perhaps is multidimensional, in other words, interpreting things not only by their prima facie presentation, but by their background presentation, it was very clear to me, and the gentleman I referenced a moment ago who became a mentor of mine over that 2010s decade, that the United States military was not in the service of the so-called Commander-in-Chief Joe Biden. They were actually in the service, the clandestine service, of Donald J. Trump. And so what that amounted to, with Trump not being publicly in office anymore, was confirmation that a continuity of government exercise had happened inside the United States and was ongoing. And when you look at what became of the Biden administration, the damage that administration did to NATO, the damage that administration did to the hegemony of U.S. Treasury bonds and the U.S. Treasury market around the world, the revamping and mapping of different trade routes, and certainly transnational crime syndicate activities in that period of time, it becomes very obvious that that continuity of government operation pinned that Hydra that I referenced a moment ago, that bloodline Hydra in control of all of the Western world's superstructures, including government, military, and faith and religious, really against the wall in a fashion that offered them no way out. We saw the Russian-Ukraine war break off, which to this day rages on and has absolutely obliterated most of the intelligence community's activities inside the Ukrainian countryside. It's also liberated tens of thousands of children from underground dungeons who had been kidnapped from various countries all over the world, especially in southeastern Europe and in Eastern Europe. and slated for whatever dark purpose that was slated for. And when we look at the rest of these world activities from 2021, 2022 up until the present day, and then cross-reference it with the successful re-election publicly of President Trump in 2024, and then we also add in the last 12 to 13 months, it becomes very apparent to me that we have a bit of an architecture playing out, that there is an orchestration happening in the world where problematic nodes or problematic junctions operating around the planet are no longer able to successfully operate. And when I say problematic, what I mean by that is antagonistic ones, things that are, or concentrations of influence and power that are working against the interests of humanity and for the interests of the globalists. A good example of this, actually, that's going to be really relevant with the events of the last 24 hours is Iran and Tehran itself. A lot of people are aware of the publicly visible, the publicly accessible information and the narratives that are put forth in the Western media space about Iran being a state sponsor of terror, and they certainly are. A lot of people are aware that the Iranian regime, or now the former Iranian regime, was actually not installed by the Iranian people at all, but by the intelligence community in the late 1970s. When we look at what is being proclaimed about Iran's activities over that period of time and their connections to certain things, we find that the intelligence community is connected to nearly all of Iran's activities, from Iran-Contra to gun running in the Middle East, to their development of nuclear weapons in the Syrian desert in the northwest of Syria, which were obliterated under Trump 1.0 in the very early days of that presidency. I believe it was January of 2017 when those missile strikes took that facility out. But a lot of people are not aware of the closed faction system that not only runs Iran, but that has maintained an isolationist financial architecture and infrastructure that is not connected to the rest of worldwide commerce, but has allowed for the movement of literally trillions of dollars of black market money. And when we talk about black market money, we're talking about money that is off book, money that has been made by warlords or paid to warlords. And we can trace the 44th presidential administration of the United States to a great deal of the funding that really bolstered that closed isolationist system. That isolationist system existed between three primary nodes. One of them was in Tehran, the other was in North Korea, and then the third one was actually concentrated in a series of Russian private banks that were not subject to the Russian Federation's national banking infrastructure or their regulations, but that were aligned and in many cases controlled by the Rothschild syndicate out of Central Europe. So what is occurring now in Iran is a multidimensional transpiration of events that is resulting in a much more stable and predictable world. Not only are we eliminating those surface level narrative problems that people are aware of, not only are we liberating the Iranian people from a bloodthirsty intelligence community backed regime that really at the end of the day owes its lineage and fealty to the Western oil corporations that first deposed the Iranian monarchy in the 1950s, but we are also eliminating a gigantic cross-section and intersectory point where massive amounts of black market money have been funding all sorts of illicit activities around the world and being concentrated in this area that now no longer exists. And so between that and the agreements that President Trump arrived at with Kim Jong-un during the first presidency, negotiations that have continued with the Koreas and with the East Asian bloc over the last 6 to 7 years, along with President Trump and President Putin's activities internally, and especially President Putin's activities internally inside of Russia to nationalize the banking infrastructure and throw the Rothschild-backed banks and bankers either in jail or out of the country. What we have, in my opinion, Veronique, is the literal transformation from the old world system to the new world system happening in real time, and we're cleaning up one of those areas that remains an obstacle to the true freedom and safety and security of humanity worldwide. I do apologize, Ms. Veronique. You may be muted.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was saying, wow, that's so beautiful how you perfectly put it, the overview or actually what we witnessed around the world today. I knew that you were the best expert to reach out to be able to give us truly what is going on behind the scene because, you know, as always, the media do not really tell the people what is truly happening. It's just everything around the surface. And I want to quickly to tell the audience that the last time you were here, you told the people that the shaking was just inevitable and that nothing can stop what is coming. While the rest of the world was looking left, you told us that we have to look right, quote unquote. And today, Helen, around the world just proved that you were right on spot, SG. So thank you very much again. So can you again, just in some way and fashion, elaborate on the current chaos, tell us where the plug is headed next, if it's possible? Maybe not, I don't know. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting. Prognostication at the beginning of any military conflict is nigh impossible because, you know, one of the problem things with war itself is that it very rarely stays how you put it or where you put it. But with respect to, you know, I think some reasonable inferences that we can draw from this sequence of events, it would make a great deal of sense that we're going to see a significant escalation in the Middle East that will ultimately involve most of the major powers. I put out recently on an audio file on that QNews Patriot channel that I referenced a moment ago that one of the byproducts of having a large regional conflict in the Middle East is that the secret societies and secret intelligence communities, which are overlapped with one another but are both distinct and not, in the sense that they have, you know, some of that overlap applies to multiple countries at the same times and some of it doesn't, but it applies to different countries in different ways. All of that is going to be dragged out, and those internal problem actors and traitors that have been literally selling out their own countries and hobbling them, and in many cases holding them hostage, will be fully exposed to their public population groups before they're eliminated or concurrently with their elimination. In Iran, for example, there's a shadow council of 22 members that has controlled the nation since the 1980s. That shadow council includes agents of the intelligence community from the Western world as well as from Iran, including Mossad agents from Israel and Shin Bet agents out of Israel. It also includes members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, high-ranking members of the Iranian military, and some of the more sadistic and salacious leaders from the civilian apparatus who meet there as well. That council has been controlling the country for the better part of 40 years now, not quite 40 years. And one of the things that has to occur in this process, if we're going to give true freedom and self-determination back to any population group of any country anywhere, is those types of shadow control structures have to be annihilated and destroyed. And so what has occurred now in Iran, I believe, is exactly that. We haven't had confirmation yet of the extent of some of these strikes. The conflict is less than 24 hours old, but we know just from the Israeli side that the Israeli Defense Force launched more than 220 separate airstrike campaigns and missions. And so what that means is that more than 200 targets potentially were targeted in this operation. We know that the United States military assisted in defanging the ability of the Iranian landscape to repulse some of those. And with the Israelis having knowledge of where these shadow councils operate and what's going on with them, it makes a great deal of sense that would have had to have factored in to any of these discussions. The same, ironically, can also be said true of Israel. And the Iranian strikes on Tel Aviv lead me to wonder if we're seeing the same thing happening in reverse. There's a council of between 13 and 17 members that is in control of Israel in the background and has been for at least the last 20 years since the war of 2006. And they meet in the underground bunkers and in the underground landscape beneath Israel regularly. So one of those bunkers is located in beneath a large residential neighborhood in Tel Aviv, and we know that several Iranian ballistics struck a neighborhood in Tel Aviv just earlier today, a few hours ago. So when we look at what's happening here, one of the pressure campaigns that I think comes out of all of this is the confusion and fear and disastrous decision-making and sort of that fright-based assessment capacity that comes when a warfare situation breaks out that is now being leveled against these secret societies and these secret intelligence brotherhoods. For the first time, they cannot predict the exact outcome of these sequences of events happening in the Middle East. They've been accustomed for over the last 40 years of being in control and having a certain amount of predictability about what military and combat outcomes would happen. And we know that that is absolutely true of everyone in the Middle East, including Iraq, when you look at the sequence of events that played out where certain individuals inside the U.S. government literally said ahead of time, months ahead of time, that we were going to be in Fallujah, that we were going to be in Mosul, that this was going to happen in Mosul, that these types of things were going to happen in Fallujah and in other areas in Baghdad. These were predictive narrative programs that were put out, but they were put out by individuals associated with those locuses of control that I'm talking about. Now, we do not have that capacity being maintained, and in fact that capacity, in my opinion, is being attacked and destroyed across the entirety of the Middle East. I believe that Saudi Arabia is going to enter this conflict relatively soon, and you're going to see some of those problematic agents that surround the crown prince in that particular nation either disappear from public view, perhaps never to be heard from again, or perhaps being destroyed in some sort of crossfire that happens from Iranian missiles, or however that looks, on the ground. And we know that one of the former prime ministers of Israel said just 11 days ago publicly inside Israel that Turkey is also a threat, quote unquote, to Israel's existence. When we talk about all of this happening, we have to separate the surface level narratives and the things we're being told by press releases, by government officials, by Western world media outlets who we know are famous for fabricating almost every single aspect of our reality and manufacturing a reality that is not actually true. But we have to separate from that and acknowledge what is happening potentially in the background. Turkey is another country that is controlled by a shadow community of intelligence operators. I'm a little bit less clear on the composition of that particular control and how it plays out, but we know that Erdogan hails from the Turkish intelligence services. So looking at what's happening on the ground in the Middle East, I'm expecting things to get probably significantly more hot before they get calmer. I would be surprised if the war with Iran and Israel directly lasts longer than a few weeks. But depending on how these things play out, we may see that war transform into a broader situation, and it could very easily involve Syria or Turkey before it's over.
Beautiful, beautiful. Wow, that's a great analysis, SJ. Thank you very much. Also today I was reading quickly on X where the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he said, today Iran is facing the severe consequence of its evil action. President Trump and the administration have made every effort to pursue peace and diplomatic solution to Iranian people, sustain nuclear ambition. This is what he was posted today, I think early this morning when I was quickly reading I also saw what you posted this morning, actually, by the way. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to quickly try to show you something. I'm pretty sure you know that you may have seen it yesterday. No, that was actually on the 26th of February. 26th of February 2026 is 66. And we have a lot of step down. So I don't know whether you were aware of it. Let me just quickly highlight it here. I don't even know how to do it since I'm not with my producer today, but I hope so. Okay. Can you see that one?
Yes, I can.
Okay. There is 3 O's, and then with the half circle, it does like a 666. And then then when we see that connection, and on the 26th of February this year, Borges, as a German call it, Borges Brand, the CEO of the World Forum Economic, stepped down. He was actually forced to resign from his position due to the links to Jeffrey Epstein and the report I read through Reuters and BBC and the Guardian article. Also coincidental was the lady called Miss Cindy McCain from the head of the World Food Organization. Is that optic for us, for the people, or is that something that it's telling us that the Great Reset is totally dead? What are your thoughts? And also what President Trump on the State of Union, how he hammered the left and the Democrats. Shame on you. Shame on you. I couldn't agree more with him. What are your thoughts on those? Thank you very much, SG.
Well, I think my thoughts, let's talk a little bit about the resignations that are happening in the real day and time. There's an entity online that many of your audience may be familiar with, and it refers to itself only as Q. And it came online during the first Trump administration, really encouraging onlookers, especially those that are citizen journalist types and independent researchers that like to go beyond the narrative that's being seeded by whatever mainstream outlet is currently seeding things at the time, and really to evaluate the events in the world with this multidimensional mindset that I'm talking about, or this espionage way of looking at things. And that entity put out a number of different commentaries, if you will, a number of different claims over a period of about 4 years or so during the first Trump administration. And one of those claims was that we needed to track and be aware of the resignations, because resignations meant that patriots acting on behalf of humanity had clandestinely gotten control of a key area or a particular part or piece of this worldwide game board, if I can utilize that metaphor. And so as we track resignations, we've seen resignations from hundreds of CEOs and corporation heads, heads of research and development, chiefs of finance, chiefs of technology, chiefs of research and discovery divisions, and all of these sorts of things. We've seen resignations across governments at all levels. We've seen resignations going all of the way down to school boards in the United States of America. Hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands by now, of arrests and investigative actions undertaken with respect to child sex crimes, child trafficking, human trafficking, these sorts of things. And so from that, I gleaned that the resignation component that was referenced by that online entity called Q, it sort of allows us to follow the pulse, if you will, of where we're at, and perhaps one of the focus areas of the current day and time, one of the present day focuses of that background shadow war that we're talking about. When we talk about shadow war, we're talking about a war being fought between the Luciferians that have been in control of a great many of the world's institutions and governments for a long time, and patriots inside of both government, military, and private sector throughout the entirety of the planet who recognize the problem and who are working in a coordinated fashion to eliminate it. So I thought it was very fascinating that the Epstein releases from the DOJ in January, and then we've had a couple of other small announcements since then about further releases to be expected. I thought it was very fascinating not only how far-reaching they were, but how some of these resignations played out. We saw Peter Mandelson in the UK, for example, resign as a result of this. We've seen Keir Starmer implicated now in at least his awareness of certain criminal activity in a fashion that is going to make it very difficult for the British political establishment to either excuse away or ignore. We've seen resignations across U.S. academia now, as well as the U.S. political landscape. We've seen a lot of pressure applied to certain individuals that even to the present day and time are ingratiating themselves in the orbit of the U.S. president, President Trump. We've also seen vindication of President Trump in these particular files, a lot of communications between Epstein and other individuals discussing how President Trump, formerly Donald Trump, citizen Donald Trump, was a cooperative entity with U.S. investigators during the first apprehension of Epstein in the 2006-2007 timeframe, and in fact was the only individual running in those types of high wealth, ultra wealthy elite circles that was willing to cooperate with those investigators and who understood that Epstein was really just a scumbag at the end of the day. So looking at the reverberative effects, and that doesn't even include resignations in France, in Hungary, and Italy, all of these different places that have been affected by these releases, but that tells me that these are areas which are now up for grabs for patriotic forces to step into and take care of. When you wage an irregular conflict or an unconventional war, a lot of times the less force that is used and that can be applied, the better off that you are. You transition things more seamlessly, you keep the pace of events flowing well, and the general public, until such a time that they become aware of these types of activities in their own research and in their own way, they're no more the wiser, and they're certainly not panicked into some sort of antagonistic point of view that delays the outcome that you're seeking if you're attempting to maintain some amount of stability in the world while transforming it from a world run on evil to a world run and supported by good. So in that sense, I would caution people to not be overly conclusive about how these things play out just yet as we watch the resignations continue, as we watch the Epstein releases continue to get more and more detailed, as citizen journalists and podcasters and commentators all across the internet have been delving into these files and exposing just how deep, just how evil, just how sick and twisted this control structure that was in the background of the Western world mostly, but really the entire world by extension really was, then that's going to propel a certain amount of awakening of its own kind and a certain amount of transitory change, which is going to be inevitable and unavoidable. With respect to the events playing out after those releases came out, with the U.S. DOJ being implicated in shielding, for example, with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, against the IEEPA tariffs in that sense. When we look at the effects that it's had inside of China, especially with President Xi's recent Chinese military purge, where another number of generals were apprehended in the dead of night and have disappeared and have not been heard from again, I think we can safely say that the exposure, the continual exposure of that entirety of the Epstein network and the Epstein group is going to drive some of these surface level events, and some of them are going to require conflict before it's over. One of the things that I find very interesting and compelling is that the most recent series of document drops from the Epstein files out of the U.S. Department of Justice very clearly suggests that Epstein was working on behalf of a number of intelligence services, not only the Israeli Mossad, but the Ukrainian intelligence service, the Italian intelligence service, and of course the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. And if this is true, that means that there is a substantial support staff, a support structure, and several communication pathways that exist in the background, which will have to be dragged out either through lawful means in a civilian fashion or lawful means in a military fashion, and be forced into the light of into the sunlight so that they can see justice and be exposed to the entirety of their own populations and the world at large. I would submit to you that some of that probably even ties back to the current events in the Middle East, but I don't want to speculate beyond what I've actually corroborated in my own research up until the present moment.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Thank you very much, SG. That's a very overview of truly what is happening behind the scene and now what people are seeing, and even more than what the mainstream media is trying to tell the people. So as you allude yearly to the Q, and also for all the independent journalists to try to do more digging to be able to really bring everything that is going on. Thank you. I'm so much appreciative of your time. We are truly witnessing the dismantling of the deep state one by one, even as just you say with your word, that Trojan horse, I would say that is kind of the domino is falling. Wow. Any idea or any thought? I know that your time is so precious, and then you maybe I don't know how long you have again, maybe 10 minutes, 5. If you could with the Greenland.
Absolutely. And I have a few more minutes, and I think we should really talk about Greenland specifically, because Greenland is, again, another one of these aspects of a multidimensional campaign that's being waged for control of key areas of not only security to individual nation states, but security of the planet itself. The Danish intelligence service and the Danish military has known for a long time that Greenland hosts a lot of evidence of extraterrestrial life that has been concentrated in the Arctic regions and that came down at different points along the way throughout our last several thousand-year period of time, and sort of set up shop in an area that they knew was going to be very hostile to typical humanity and was going to not be, highly explored and highly foot trafficked in the sense of awareness and exposure. And so when we look at what is actually in Greenland, one of the things that's underneath the Greenland ice and the Greenland shelf, and it's underneath Iceland as well, there's a massive tunnel that goes, it's a submarine tunnel beneath the North Atlantic Ocean between Iceland and Greenland. But one of the things beneath Greenland specifically is an enormous military research installation that has been reverse engineering not only extraterrestrial technology, but studying extraterrestrial style microbes and attempting to weaponize them in a fashion that they can survive in the highly ultraviolet photonic environment of this planet, right? The sunlight itself really is the best disinfectant for us as humanity, and it's one of the primary defense mechanisms against pathogens that are not of earthly origin. And I know that that sounds nuts for a lot of people out there. They're going to sort of reel back as they hear that, listening to this broadcast or others like it. But the fact remains that we are not alone in this wonderful, incredible universe that God has created for all of us, and that God is not to be put in a box necessarily, that the expression of sentient life and the glorification of the spirit through that expression of life happens in ways that many of us have never really been taught about, because it's not been within the interests of that Luciferian control structure to allow our awareness to expand to that degree. But it is true that some of these things exist and that they're being researched and cataloged, that there's a great deal of interaction that goes on between very high levels of the U.S. government, very high levels of the NATO federation of countries, to include groups to include groups like Majestic 12 and Magic 12. This is one of the highly compartmented sections of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Base, and they have been quite literally interacting with entities that are not of earthly origin, and that many of whom are actually not for the proliferation and elongation of the human genome into the future. We do have friends out there, and I don't want to make it appear even for a moment that we're sort of alone, left to our own devices, with other entities that are sentient having hostility towards us, but it is true that some of them do. And so as we look at the U.S. military's activities in Greenland, there's already a Space Force base that is there and has been there for a while. That was formerly a base that was under the control and jurisdiction of the United States Air Force secret intelligence programs and secret space research programs. When we look at the Danish military's activities in that area of the world, as well as the French intelligence services and the British intelligence services, and a lot of the visits that have happened between high-ranking politicians from France and Britain and Denmark as well as Germany, it becomes very clear that this is an important arena, and not only because it has a tremendous amount of mineral wealth. Now that is also true, and that happens to be a byproduct of any sort of negotiation or aim that any country has towards Greenland or any of the rest of the Arctic, to include certain component parts of the Canadian Arctic. But fundamentally, the most important aspect of what is going on there is by getting control of Greenland in a patriotic sense, wresting control away from this occultic secret society style hydra that is the extension, again, of those bloodline families we talked about in the beginning of our call today. We achieve not only liberation of certain wealth for the Greenlander Inuits that have been there for a long time. We achieve not only the redefinition of North Atlantic security in the sense that rogue assets are not going to be able to sort of pull off and have a safe harbor transiting from the Bering Strait, or excuse me, not the Bering Strait, transiting from the North Sea or the Baltic Sea or things like that down into the Atlantic proper. All of that is also true, but the primary aim here is the securing of planetary safety and control. And Greenland, along with Antarctica, is one of the major areas that this has to occur, or we cannot say that we've truly secured our domain here as humanity on this earth. And when I say our domain, I literally am talking about humankind. I'm talking about the creation of God, the descendants of Edom, of Adam in the days of old, right? Adam is the bloodline, the crystalline bloodline of the Holy Spirit of the living God himself. And so as we look at the possession of this world and the regency that humankind was given as a result of their rank, if you will, as a result of their place in the created hierarchy under all creation, we have not had control of our own house for a very, very long time. That control was usurped very heavily over the last 500 years by entities that are not of earthly origin, and it really accelerated dramatically after the Second World War, when some of those entities were able to establish such a low frequency condition around the entirety of the planet that they became phasable. And when we say phasable, it means that they were able to move from one extremely low frequency, what we would call ELF dimension, into a more visible physical dimensionality of existence here in our world. That discussion is going to take us into quantum physics, and I don't have quite enough time for that today. But I would encourage people to look up interdimensionality and how things like quantum entanglement and the synchronization of dimensionality fields, if you will, is able to occur. And so after the Second World War, this was done en masse to the entirety of the planet, because the planet itself had been so heavily desecrated and so heavily assaulted with not only the weaponry of the war and what actually happened in that war, but the deployment of other hidden activities, radio frequency weaponry, radar-based weaponry, sonar-based weaponry that adjusted the frequency gradient of quite literally the Earth itself, allowing for the emergence of some of these entities to a more forward posture of control. Now, in the present day and time, we see the Earth sort of transitioning back. We can track things like the Schumann resonance, which is the overall resonant wavelength coming from the planet itself, and how it has been rising pretty consistently and uniformly, going all of the way back to the year 2012, 2013. And when we pair that with the activities of needing to secure some of these areas like Greenland, like Antarctica, like the Russian Arctic, which we've seen Russia heavily involved in the last 4 to 5 years, like the Canadian Arctic, which we know U.S. Special Forces have been operating in under so-called training exercises for at least the last 5 to 6 years. If we read the press releases, it becomes very obvious that we're not only seeing these nation-state activities on behalf of the selfish aims of those states themselves, but also sort of adding into the cauldron, if you will, coming all together in the mixture of securing the planet and taking away or destroying these non-earthly control structures that have existed with impunity in these areas for a very, very long time.
That is mind-blowing. Wow. We've been living a life for over 500 years, SG. And I'm so glad that you are able to really give us all those information, especially for our audience who are still a little bit kind of waking up now. But that information concerning Greenland, just spot on. Many people have been saying, oh, why President Trump is going to Greenland? Why this? Why that? Why that? Now, when they hear the information that you bring on the table, beautiful. And thank you very much. Wow. Oh, my gosh. Did you have any final remark? Because I know you said no more than 45 minutes. I don't want to be holding you too much on. I know there's a lot happening. There's a lot going on the current event out there. But, I want to be mindful of your time too. Very much.
Well, I very much appreciate that. And I think my final remarks would sort of echo our discussion today. I told people very recently on the audio file that I put out on QNews Patriot, the audio files is the name that I use for the commentary broadcasts that I air periodically on my Rumble platform, that in order to understand what is happening in the world in present day, you cannot look at it with only a reactive modality of thinking. And when I say reactive modality, what I mean is in response to what you are physically observing. The world around us, which we have physically observed for our entire lives, as you correctly pointed out a moment ago, has been a complete and total farce. We can physically observe, for example, across the entirety of the United States and the Western world, that power, electricity, is delivered to us on these power lines that are erected on power poles, which go back to transformer stations and generation stations and things of that nature, most of which are burning some form of either fossil fuel or coal fuel. A few of them in certain countries are burning nuclear energy, producing nuclear energy, but most of it is being done through resources that require monetary engagement in order to maintain the supply of them. And yet that visible reality, that visual reality that we see with our own eyes, that we can touch with our own hands, it's a lie. It's a complete falsehood. If you ascend into the atmosphere as little as 125 feet up, you can actually pull atmospheric electricity right out of the air. It's called the ether. And if you look at the old cathedrals across the entirety of Central Europe, most notably the massive cathedral in Cologne and the massive cathedral in Bonn, Germany, they look like power transformers. They're literally transducers with diodes on them. And so when we look at that, and we look at the resonant construction of certain cathedral complexes across all of Europe and how they match up almost perfectly with electricity dissemination geometrics, which are utilized in the present day and time from power stations and power plants and things like that, it becomes obvious that even the visual reality that we behold has not been true, that there is so much more to it. And so when we look at the events happening in the world, when we see the events happening on television or online, or even things that we're witnessing firsthand with our own eyes and with our own ears, we shouldn't discount them in the sense that they're not real, because they obviously are real, but we should stop fooling ourselves into believing that they constitute the whole story, because they don't. The whole story itself is one of majesty and beauty that we've never been told, that we've never been taught about, that the Luciferian occultic control structure across the entirety of the world could not let us know about, because if we did, we would break away very quickly. We are photonic, light-based beings. We're extensions quite literally of God's wonderful and mighty Holy Spirit. If you look at a strand of human DNA under the most intense magnification possible, which is electron microscopy, that strand is emitting light. There's nothing causing that emission, but it is being funneled into this dimension by the Spirit itself. We have carbon in our makeup, but we are not carbon-based beings. We are light-based beings. And so looking at that and what we would be able to do with that kind of awareness and understanding of the world, it makes a great deal of sense that we've had to live that lie for however long it's been. I would submit to you at least 1,000 years in its current form, because only then could that hyper-concentrated and very insular, closed group of what I would characterize as dark occultists and sycophants and sort of psychopaths, many of whom actually have been interacting and interbreeding with non-humanoids in that period of time. Only through our ignorance are they able to maintain control and power. And now, for the first time in history, Veronique, we're all collectively realizing that not only has our world been a lie, but we know why it's been a lie. And allowing the why to come forth allows us to properly assess what to do next. And what we're going to end up doing through this process is changing the earth back to a balance that it has not seen for thousands of years. We will see flora beginning to grow in places that it hasn't grown for millennia. We'll see fauna multiplying and probably enlarging in size as we go forward over the years and decades to come. We'll see abundance and prosperity restored to the world in ways that we've never known and haven't known for thousands of years, and that's going to carry humanity, I think, forward for hundreds and hundreds of years in an advancement posture that ultimately will allow us to interact with other light-based beings out there. We are not the only ones. There are extraterrestrials or other sentient life forms, if you want to call them that also have a photon makeup and that are really pulling for us and rooting for us in this period of time. This is not just about liberating oil and minerals or liberating governments from election fraud or treason or liberating militaries from co-opting and bureaucratic manipulation. This is about liberating our spiritual identity and unleashing the true potential of all of humanity collectively upon this earth. That has never happened before, and it's going to be mind-blowing to see as we go forward in the years to come.
Beautiful. What a great ending of the conversation. Wow. Beautiful, SG. And I like the fact that you highlight the cathedral. All those cathedral houses were built to harvest our energy. Would you like to give us, how you call it, all your social media handle, follow us? I know I have it down here. If you want me, I could just read it to the people.
Yes, I do. I can be found in 4 places online.
Yeah.
I can be found on rumble.com. And that is rumble.com/user/QNews Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon. And I can be found on Truth Social, X, and Telegram at varying handles. On Truth Social, my handle is real, R-E-A-L, SG Anon with a red check mark. On X, the handle is a little different. It's at the THE-Q News Patriot with a blue check mark. And on Telegram, the Telegram address for the Telegram channel we operate is t.me/real, R-E-A-L, Q News Patriot. Veronique, thank you very much for having me back. I do wish that I had a little bit more time, but personal world events do require my attention. But these types of broadcasts are the reason that the awakening will ultimately be successful worldwide. And really, at the end of the day, we have to do it collectively in order to secure our future and our children.
Thank you very much, SG, for your availability today and also for everything that you actually share with our audience. We can't thank you enough. Really, you are a treasure for the nation, not only for America, but world. Wow, we are even privileged to know you and have you come and share with our audience everything that you know, and so that the mask will be removed from their face and also the dullness from their ears, and they will truly turn into what is true. Thank you again, and thank you for the privilege of your time. Thank you very much, Ezri.
Thank you, and God bless.
God bless. Well, follow us on all these various platforms. We are going to post on the comment every social media platform of SG. And thank you very much again for the privilege of your time today for watching. And also please share again with all your entourage this broadcast, because people perish because of lack of knowledge. Thank you, and until next time, see you. Bye-bye. Signing off.